Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very accomplished professional from India, Mr. Nikhil Raval. Nikhil, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ashutosh. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Nikhil is the founder of Learn Wisely, which is a leadership and talent transformation consulting organization. He's an author. He's an author of a book titled Understanding the Gen Z Mindset on Work Life, Brands, Learning, and More. And he's the host of a podcast, which is titled Working with Gen Z. So, Nikhil, before we start talking about Gen Z, tell me a little bit about your own journey in brief.
Sure. Thank you once again, Ashutosh. My journey is essentially kind of broken up in two buckets. I spent about 15 years of my career, of my life in the US. Like a good Gujarati, I was exported to my destination land very early in life.
Yeah.
I did some education there, and I worked in the financial services for close to a decade with sales and fund accounting, auditing. And at one stage, I cleared all my exams for CFA, and I thought that that's the way life will take me. And then, of course, as we all know, that sometimes the path that you resist the most is
Right.
the path that destiny kind of tends to take you. So anyway, in 2002, I had come back and I wanted to raise our children in India, and that's when I forayed into teaching, training, and consulting. And I said I'll do just about anything, but I won't do that. But I think it grew on to me. Many events led me to kind of get into that profession. And in my last role, I was the MD of a company called Duke CE, where we build leadership solutions, where we had a partnership with IIM Ahmedabad. So it's a very good ringside view of how leadership works. I had a chance to travel extensively around 25, 30 countries and see very senior accomplished leaders to see what they do. And 2018 is kind of, I said, I'll jump off the treadmill to do something on my own.
Fascinating. And that's when you started thinking about understanding the Gen Z mindset. So let me start by asking you, what got you interested in this segment of the Gen Z?
Sure. Ashutosh, I had two very good mentors who pushed me, given the space that I was in, to write a bit, read up. Reading up, of course, I was an avid reader, but and I always resisted it. But anyway, it slowly built upon to me. And in 2018, when I was offered an APAC role, I said, okay, I'm going to step down because I had a father who had some health issues and a young Gen Z boy at home. And I said that this is perhaps a good time. This is just at the cusp of COVID, said to actually do something which I wanted to do. And I said that let's do something which there isn't, there's a lot of curiosity. And I said, why not pursue a generation where everybody's grappling with it? And I looked at my 15 years of consulting work, and I said that this is perhaps the one place where a lot of companies are struggling, despite everything that you see in terms of engagement scores and CSAT scores and whatnot. To how do you hold on to talent, and how do you groom them, and that context has changed fundamentally. So I took some of the learnings that I saw, I did a bit of a research, and I said that this is an area where I like to learn more, both as a parent and as a professional. And so that's the reason. Yeah.
So therefore, my first question to you is, how do the values and priorities of Gen Z differ from those of the previous generations, which are, say, the millennials or the Gen X?
Sure. Yeah, they are quite fundamentally different. If one is a parent, I'm sure they can vouch for that. But before I talk through what are some of the values, I think context matters. And so when we look at the prior generations, every generation has a kind of a context which becomes the foundation of sort of their beliefs, and their beliefs is what it shapes our values, and that is what we bring to work. So we've always heard that if we had parents in the boomer generation, they always valued loyalty, they valued hard work, they valued the hierarchy, in fact. And that's because the context in which they came, right? There wasn't as many opportunities, and they were told that, look, if you got a good job, hold on to it and retire out of that place. So likewise, when you think about the Gen X, Gen Y, their context was different. X is perhaps the one generation which is called the sandwich generation or the forgotten generation, because they're the one generation which are grappling two generations at the time, which means that they have aging parents that they're responsible for. They have young children either in Gen Y or Gen Z. And this is a generation perhaps where work was becoming mobile, the talent was becoming mobile. You were working for multinationals, you were grappling with time zones, leading teams in across zones, and so on. And so therefore, work-life balance became a big thing for X. For the Y, is the one generation where there's been written perhaps the most amount of literature is there, which is the millennial generation, because the mistake that happened for the experts to say that this will become just like another generation, it didn't turn out quite like that, because there again, context was different. They were the generation which were born where technology was being accepted. They were happy to showcase who they were on technology, and there were much more choices. They were much more entrepreneurial. Now, if you shift to the Gen Z, their context is fundamentally very, very different, right? So they're in their quarter life, right? The eldest of the Gen Z would be about 26. They've already seen two wars now. They've seen a full pandemic. They've seen climate crisis. They're experiencing climate crisis, energy crisis. They're experiencing things like the fake movement, the Me Too movement, the fake news. And therefore, their values are shaped by some of those things, right? That's why when we hear and see that the Gen Z values a company who is passionate about sustainability. The Gen Z values a company who is very keen on diversity. The Gen Z values a company who is on the cutting edge of digitization, because they were born into the internet. And so a lot of what we hear and see about Gen Z, or maybe even the stereotypes, is again shaped by their context. So their values are fundamentally again different, because they've seen many different things in their first 25 years of life.
Very well said. The other question that I had was that how has growing up with technology and social media shaped Gen Z's worldview and their behavior?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say the technology, Ashutosh, has perhaps been the common denominator in their life, in every sphere, every dimension of their life. So if you think about how they look at communication. If we look at our work careers, we can think back to days when we had people to write memos, then we had emails, then we had other forms of communication, voice communication, right? And now people are saying that that's old, that's archaic, right? And therefore you think about communicating through apps like Zoom and Teams and chat. And therefore, even that's old. So now they're feeling part of voice rate. So communication is one. If you think about how they think about, shopping as a consumer, right? I have my son, even if it's 5 minutes away from our house, he will say, "Dad, why should I walk when a Swiggy person can just come and deliver it to me?" So, right. So the way they consume and how they become as a consumer, you can think about how they learn. Right. From our days, perhaps we can say, we were told to go to the library, listen to the teacher, and just kind of, that was the final word. Here is a generation which can challenge back to the teacher immediately, right? While the teacher is saying something, they have a Google response which can either negate or validate what they're saying. So every aspect, from learning to how they think about buying, even how they see relationships, right? So or even, for example, how they manage finances. Back in the day, we would prefer to talk to our advisor or go to the bank. The whole concept is alien, right? Everything is online, everything is instant. And therefore, every sphere of life, technology has become a common denominator. And there are pros and cons to that, but we spoke about 3 or 4 where that has a huge impact on how they see the world.
Said, thank you. What a great response. The other aspect that I wanted to ask you was that given all the work that you've done with Gen Z, what are some of the common misconceptions that a lot of people have about Gen Z, and how should they start to understand Gen Z better?
Sure. So every generation, there is, I think if we were to go and Google and say, okay, stereotypes of Generation X or stereotypes of Baby Boomer or Y or Z, right? And the Google will just start throwing out, sentences that, okay, you're narcissistic or you're this or you're that. So the stereotypes are are just that, but perhaps there's maybe some truth to it as to why they're being labeled that way. So in case of Gen Z, a lot of the misconception, some partially true again, but a large, where you think about, okay, why they're labeled a certain way. One could be the fact that, look, they're not very loyal when it comes to workplace. And I think in the Indian context, Ashutosh, I would say that there is again a slightly different lens to it, because if you go to tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 cities, I think they're far more aspirational, they're far more hungry, and therefore they are loyal. But if you go to South Mumbai, or if you go to Gurgaon, or if you go to Whitefield in Bangalore, I think maybe that Gen Z is thinking, if I don't like, I'll just walk across and go and get another job. So one is, of course, this misconception of they're not loyal. Second is the fact that they're very sensitive. They're very fragile, right? So again, maybe some of that is driven by the context. And so if you think about the stress levels, and if you think about what they've experienced in the pandemic, one can argue that yes, mental well-being is not just an issue for them, but perhaps even for other generations, right, who experienced it, right? Loneliness and some of the things that companies are grappling with is something that everybody was grappling with. So I don't think that you can say that it's just confined to them. So that's another one. Third, of course, you also hear that they're lazy, and they want to get to a stage from one part of their life to, let's say, another very quickly. And again, as I say, I think in the Indian context, that's very, very different, where I've known a lot of companies just hiring in tier 3, tier 4 cities, simply because they find the right talent, they have the right attitude, they have the hunger in them. So again, the list can go on, but I mean, these are some of the, and they don't do anything without technology. But I would question that even, what's the tech quotient for the others around us, right? So I think some of these are more just that.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting. So my next couple of questions are with the Gen Zs and marketing or branding. How do the Gen Zs value authenticity, and how do they detect and respond to inauthentic messaging?
Sure. So I think, once again, this is a generation which has got a slightly different context. And so they are spoiled for choices in terms of what they can get. But furthermore, that's given that they were born into the social media, born into the internet. I think the fundamental distinction that I always say between a Y and a Z is that Generation Y accepted technology, Gen Z expects technology, and therefore that's changed the way they interact and they do things, right? So, for instance, if I'm buying something, the first thing they're going to do is that I'm going to look at my reviews. If I'm going to join a company, I'm going to go look at Glassdoor. I'm going to go look at Fishbowl, right? And therefore, I think it matters to them. And I think they're looking for congruence for companies who say something and kind of walk the talk. So I'll give you a couple of examples. There was this famous ad by Pepsi where they had this young model who was this white lady. She's white by color and race, and therefore they got trolled massively. This was right when there was this Black Lives Movement happening, and I think they were trying to capitalize in a way, almost trivializing, saying that, okay, why is it that you have a white person? And so again, I think you could see immediately that I think, was Pepsi really serious about what they said? And I think you could see online and so on, that to withdraw and the Pepsi to apologize and so on. And similarly, again, there are other examples where companies have talked about, a body type or a size. And they look at, for example, if you look at companies like IBM, they talk about Smarter Planet. If you look at Starbucks, they talk about Shared Planet. If you look at, so some of these companies who say my tagline is this, they actually go and say that, okay, do they actually kind of walk the talk? And that's how they, want to make sure that, are they really authentic?
Well said. And at the workplace, how are Gen Z changing, the workplace, and how are they redefining success?
Sure. So the workplace, again, I think their expectation of them coming into the workplace is also they're expecting different, because you know, if I am spending 10 hours on a device or online, and I'm, you know, putting something online, what's my speed to time in getting a feedback? It's literally 30 seconds or less than that, right? So I put something and I get a comment back. And so that becomes their level of expectation, rightly or wrongly, when they go back to work. So, you know, if you go back and tell and say that, look, we're going to do an appraisal 6 months from now and a year from now, I think you've lost them. And therefore, every company is grappling with that. And a lot of the work that I do, I tell the leaders that, look, you could have one way that the HR is design system, but what's stopping you in your own teams to have frequent feedback? So they want frequent feedback. They also want an environment, almost something that they're expecting, which is that can you be a bit more empathetic and create a safe environment for me? It's almost just that, because their context has been different, right? And they're not shy about it. So I think they want feedback, they want a safe environment, they expect and see diversity as a big thing. They're quite passionate about purpose. I recall buying, an iPhone recently, and my son says that, Dad, why don't we buy a pink phone? I said, I don't really have a preference. He said, no. I said, why pink? He says that because if you buy pink, all the proceeds from the sales actually go to some cancer cell research or something. So I think they're passionate about companies who mean some of these things. So they're changing the workplace, and for them, success again is not defined the traditional way we saw it, where we say that, look, you're going to spend 20 years, you're going to be a vice president, right? They're quite happy to take time off, just a year into workplace, 2 years into workplace, go out, travel, explore. And they know that I think they've been handed a card, a set of cards, which according to them is not what they had looked for, but they want to make the best of that.
Great response. Thank you. My next question, Nikhil, is that, when you look at traditional milestones, I don't know, I'm from the boomers generation, you're younger, but they were traditional, milestones like owning a home, marriage, starting a family. How does Gen Z view these so-called traditional milestones?
Sure. Yeah, again, you're absolutely correct. I would say, Ashutosh, it's not confined to, maybe just the boomer generation. Even I think of the X generation, perhaps, in many ways it's traditional in that sense. And therefore, but again, if you think about the Gen Z, they're born into a shared economy, right? So Uber has always been there. Airbnb has always been there as far as they're concerned, right? So what's the reason for me to, buy a car? What's the reason for me to own a house? And again, in tier 2, tier 3 cities, I think the story of how we look at money and the literacy and how that played a role is fundamentally, again, very different, right? I think in the urban towns, if you're more affluent, you've got one view of life and how you see it. If you're in the smaller towns, again, it's a different story. And again, when you think about relationships, similar stories where the fact that the traditional kind of, at least in the Indian context, where we say that, look, if I'm a parent and I have a son or a daughter at a certain age, probably advise that they should consider getting married and a family, and all of that's being questioned. Right? That template is not a template that they want to try. They want to. You've heard things like live-in relationship. You've heard things like and even the concept of a divorce or a divorce is not something that they will feel very shocked about. Sadly or rightly, wrongly, from our generation, but as you said, my goodness, how can that happen, or what went wrong, right? And so I think some of their context of how consumerism has changed things, how what they see around them, right? The world is becoming very, very polarized. How much what you see and read, how much what you want to believe is also something that one has to really work hard nowadays to say that, what's being fed to me, is that really, is that the ideology that's there, or Is it a group of people that's trying to create a narrative and so on and so forth? So I think it's a tough task, and as parents or as managers, I think we've got to help them in some of these situations, and help
Yes.
them, because there's a term that's been used, that's called, there was always a term called the midlife crisis, but I think for the Gen Z there's a term called the quarter life crisis. So that crisis has come much earlier
Amazing.
than
Yeah.
the yeah.
They've had to see much more of the world very early in life. And
Yeah,
you're so
yeah,
right about this. So I have time for two more questions for you.
sure.
The next question, Nikhil, is how are Gen Z addressing and navigating the complexities of identity, whether it is in terms of race, gender, or sexuality?
Yeah, again, I think just building on our previous question, you're seeing, for example, what happened with the Black Lives Matter movement. We've seen recently the bill that was passed when you saw about the inclusion of the women in the parliament and so on. And so I think diversity has become a real issue for them, or a issue where they're very passionate. They're also very passionate about other things that we spoke about, right? Sustainability
Yeah.
and so on and so forth. And and I can think of examples. So I don't know if there is a gentleman called Boyan Slad. I don't know if you've kind of read about him.
No.
Yeah, he's actually created this company called the Ocean Cleanup, where he was out there and he saw how bad this Pacific Ocean and the amount of garbage that was there, and so he delivered a TED talk, and all of a sudden he's getting funding from all these places where companies are wanting to kind of help him. So there are many such as kind of stories where you're seeing that they're not walking the traditional path, right?
Mhm.
I know the other day my son was saying that there's a tennis player in Australia. I'm trying to remember,
Mhm.
Ashley Barty, or
Mhm.
so again, she was at the top of her game in her 20s, number one for more than 200 weeks, and all of a sudden, right in the prime, right before, she just walked away saying that, look, this is, I want to give this up because I want to discover another part of me. I want to discover.
Yes.
So I think there are more stories where they're questioning the normal model that we have been kind of told, with identity, and again, things like that. As I said, um, uh, you know from the prior generations, our view of how it should be and how it is, it's again something that they're experiencing it very differently, and their parents are grappling with that, right? And perhaps almost kind of saying that, maybe maybe I be a little more open to another perspective. They may not agree to some of this.
Well said. And my last question to you, Nikhil. How has growing up in a post 9/11 world affected Gen Z's perspectives on global events and politics?
Yeah, it's just a very, very complex and different context, right? I mean, they've seen 9/11, they've seen 26/11, they've seen the Ukraine war, now they're seeing one more war. They're living in a world where there's things like fake news, deep fake, AI, and so on, right? And uh, from our time, perhaps when we heard in our MBA schools that it's about globalization and so on, and I think the trend is kind of reversed, where it's more deglobalization, and I think nations are looking inwards. It's
Mm.
becoming more nationalistic, and again, a lot of these events are shaping their ideologies, right? And so you question to say that, okay, it's not a world where it's there was always like, you have the VUCA, but it's now VUCA on steroids.
Mm.
And the new normal for every one of us is for us is different. But imagine just being 25 years into life and seeing so much.
Yeah.
So I think it's a very fragile place to be. On top of that, you have AI, you have ML, where there's prediction that a lot of the junior level jobs, the entry level jobs will be gone away.
Mm.
And therefore, so what do you do? Here is a generation who doesn't have as much experience. They're coming into a workforce. Some of those operational jobs are going to be gone away. So it's not an easy place. I mean, both perhaps from a parent's perspective, as a company's perspective, I think a lot of handholding needs to be done. But I think like any other cycle of life, any other cycle of business, it seems like that. But in retrospect, I'm sure we can look back to say that we learned a lot, but this is something that can be done.
Absolutely, absolutely. And on that note, and your amazing conversation, thank you, Nikhil, for speaking to me about so many different aspects of the Gen Z mindset. I mean, I'm from the boomers generation, and every time I talk to young people, I often tell them, I said that I have so much hope in what the millennials and the Gen Zs are doing, because my generation seems to have messed up the whole world. And I always say that you people will probably change the world for the better, as I'm sure you all are doing. Thank you for speaking to me about so many different perspectives that you gave to me and to my viewers and listeners. Thank you again for speaking to me, and good luck.
Thank you, Ashutosh. Pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.